It's Friday, it's 12:15, and this is Politics UK. Welcome to your weekly roundup of political and parliamentary highlights from around the UK. I'll be joined by correspondents in Edinburgh, Cardiff and Belfast, and here in Westminster by our parliamentary correspondent Sean Curran. On the programme this week...
There is absolutely no question, Mr. Speaker, of the lights going out or people being unable to heat their homes.
These energy price rises turn the indefensible decision on universal credit into an unconscionable one.
The spike in gas prices keeps living costs and the economy on the agenda at Westminster.
When Labour takes office, unemployment goes up and the economy goes down.
He talks about the economy, he doesn't even know how much his own holiday costs.
In Scotland, should you be prosecuted for having Class A drugs?
Police officers may therefore choose to issue a recorded police warning for simple possession offences for all classes of drugs.
The answer to our drug deaths crisis is treatment, not de facto decriminalisation.
At Lib Dem conference, Ed Davey blames the Prime Minister for this.
Shoppers greeted by empty shelves in the supermarket. House building materials stopped for lack of materials. Pubs running dry.
Let's start today's programme in Westminster with Sean Curran and the focus on gas prices and the gas industry. What's been going on?
Yeah, this has been a huge topic of conversation and political discussion, not just here at Westminster, but I would think probably round kitchen tables up and down the UK, because hundreds of thousands of people now face the prospect of having to move to a new energy provider because of this crisis with gas prices. Basically, the companies that we use to get our gas and electricity from have faced a huge increase in the amount that they have to pay to get their gas supplies. They can't pass all of that on to us because there's a price cap in place, but it has caused a crisis in the industry, and we've seen a number of energy providers go bust this week. And it's also meant that ministers have been under pressure all this week in Parliament to explain exactly what's going on, and they've been asked several times what they are going to do. So, Monday, the start of the parliamentary week, the Business Secretary, Kwasi Kwarteng, came to Parliament and made a statement.
We have sufficient capacity and more than sufficient capacity to meet demand, and we do not expect supply emergencies to occur this winter. There is absolutely no question, Mr. Speaker, of the lights going out or people being unable to heat their homes. There'll be no 3-day working weeks or a throwback to the 1970s. Such thinking, Mr. Speaker, is alarmist, unhelpful and completely misguided. The government will not be bailing out failed companies. There will be no rewards for failure or mismanagement. The taxpayer should not be expected to prop up companies which have poor business models.
I welcome his caution about outcomes which lead to taxpayer subsidy for big companies to further concentrate their market share. But can he therefore explain what the alternatives are and what he proposes happens to the customers of suppliers that do not get through this crisis? He's making a statement later on this afternoon. It'd be good to know what he's going to say. Families are facing a triple whammy: rising energy prices, national insurance rises, and at the end of this month, the £1,000 cut in universal credit. Mr. Speaker, these energy price rises turn the indefensible decision on universal credit into an unconscionable one.
He mentioned the energy price cap, but what he failed to acknowledge was the fact that in just a matter of weeks, the energy price cap will be at its highest level ever. So will he therefore back new financial support for those in the lowest income households? What message would he have for the likes of the Prime Minister, who of course told us in 2016 that if we vote to leave the European Union, then energy bills will be reduced.
I don't think energy efficiency or home insulation has passed his lips once in this afternoon's debate. So when is he going to properly learn the lessons of the failed Green Homes Grant, the Green Deal, the scrapping of zero carbon homes? When is he going to put in place the comprehensive street-by-street, local authority-led insulation scheme that we know will get emissions down, fuel prices down and jobs up right across the country?
Sean, the government's been at pains to repeat that the lights will stay on, there won't be a problem with supply, but the opposition parties definitely galvanising around this issue of a cost of living crisis and some market failure, smaller companies closing. What is the industry going to do about it?
Well, the industry has been much more gloomy than ministers. Prime Minister, on his way to New York, was suggesting that we should think of this as a bit like the moment when a TV programme ends and everybody goes out and pops the kettle on. And so he said it's a temporary blip. Now, a lot of analysts say that they think the wholesale gas prices are going to stay high for quite a bit longer than that. And it's not just going to be a little glitch. The industry has been talking about whether it could get any support from the government. They saw this week that the government had stepped in to help reopen fertiliser plants. This is possibly the most unusual part of this story, that fertiliser is used to produce carbon dioxide. The carbon dioxide is used in the food and packaging industry. And so a big spike in the price of gas for the gas companies could lead to empty supermarket shelves. So everything is all connected. So they were thinking, well, if you can help the fertiliser companies, can you help us? The government has been very firm, and I think the line has got firmer through the week in Parliament, that they're not going to be bailing out companies. This week, a group of MPs on the Business Select Committee got the opportunity to talk to the industry and the regulator about what might happen next.
So just to give you an idea of the scale of change in the gas price is almost 6 times the level it was last year, and indeed it rose 70% in August. So we are in unprecedented cost territory, and I'm afraid, there are many, many factors that have contributed to that, including an increased international demand, potentially some restrictions around supply. So it's very, very hard to predict how long that will last.
What you think gave the Prime Minister the confidence to say it was going to be a temporary issue? Are there particular factors at play that might be temporary?
Well, I think when you look at commodity markets as a whole, when you see a spike like this, history has suggested that those spikes do go away. All I'd say right now is that, that's not something that we Ofgem would rely on.
When the Secretary of State made a statement to the House a couple of days ago, he almost said that at this time of year, it's not uncommon for gas prices to go up and companies to get into difficulty. So how actually significant is the current situation?
So look, I do think this is a different kind of change. The sector has faced shocks, and in fact, we've talked about how we've managed through the COVID crisis, which had a big impact on the energy sector overall. But when you see that change, and I encourage you just to have a look at the change in the gas price, it really is something that we don't think we've seen before at this pace. And so in a sense, when we think about the impacts, one thing I want to emphasise is let's just start with customers. And unfortunately, when you see costs like this change, ultimately that will feed through to bills. And something we Ofgem are concerned about is making sure that customers are looked after throughout the changes and the impact on the sector.
You would expect normally that the price would revert to the mean. It's not something that we think is going to be sustainable. But of course, Mr. Jones, we have to prepare for longer term high prices. We're looking at all options. I think what they're doing in Spain is recognising that it's an entire system. The energy system is an entire system. But I'm in discussion with Ofgem and other officials looking at all options. Some of the industry players are saying we should remove the price cap. I've absolutely rebuffed that. I said the price cap is here to stay. We're not moving it, and they have to work within that context.
And Sean, there was another urgent question in the House of Commons about rising energy prices on Thursday.
That's right. The Shadow Business Secretary, Ed Miliband, asked an urgent question to bring Kwasi Kwarteng back to the Commons to face questions from MPs. He accused the Minister of being complacent about this crisis. Kwasi Kwarteng, you won't be surprised to hear, insisted the government wasn't being complacent and insisted that throughout all of this, he would put the consumer, the domestic customer, first.
Thanks for now, Sean. Let's go over to Scotland. Our political correspondent Lindsay Bew is outside Holyrood. Lindsay, a significant shift in drug policy has been announced by Scotland's new Lord Advocate.
That's right, Joe. Yes, the Scottish Government is under real pressure to deal with the drug deaths crisis. The most recent figures showed the country has the highest rate in Europe. And a couple of months ago, when MSPs debated this issue, they voted to support a review of guidance on recorded police warnings. Now, it is the Lord Advocate here who's responsible for drawing up those guidelines for police on which offences can be considered for a warning. And the new Lord Advocate, Dorothy Bain, in her first appearance in front of MSPs in the chamber, announced she would be extending that to include possession of Class A drugs.
I have decided that an extension of the recorded police warning guidelines to include possession of offences for Class A drugs is appropriate. Police officers may therefore choose to issue a recorded police warning for simple possession offences for all classes of drugs.
The answer to our drug deaths crisis is treatment, not de facto decriminalisation by the back door, as is the case today. And sadly, nothing that has been said in today's statement will stop drug deaths. Nothing that has been said today will guarantee access to that needed treatment, something which our Right to Recovery Bill is calling for. May I ask the Lord Advocate on this matter? There is a very fine balance between possession of drugs and drug dealing. How are police officers expected to enforce this new guidance?
No one measure is going to reverse the appalling levels of drug-related deaths that you so rightly refer to. But the criminal justice system has a role to play in reducing harms caused by drugs to our communities, both in terms of disrupting the activities of drug dealers and ensuring that, where appropriate, help is offered to vulnerable individuals. There is a significant distinction to be made by those involved in the supply of drugs and those who are drug dealers who destroy communities, and those vulnerable individuals who are addicted to drugs for a whole variety of reasons.
Now, you heard there criticism of this move from the Scottish Conservatives. Others have welcomed it, saying that this marks a real change in direction of treating this as a public health crisis. But organisations who support those recovering from drug addiction say that this is not going to be a silver bullet, and they have called for it to be backed up by greater investment in rehabilitation services.
Well, Lindsay, it continues to be a difficult subject for the government in Scotland. We've got more details too on the COVID passport scheme the Scottish Government's introducing from the 1st of October. Tell us about it.
Yes, from next month in Scotland, if you want to go to a nightclub or some larger events, then you will need to show proof that you have been double vaccinated. Now, the government came forward with more details of this scheme this week. They have now defined what they are seeing as a nightclub in law, and they have also announced that when it comes to larger events like football matches, spot checks will be acceptable rather than checking every single person, and they have said that venues should use their common sense when it comes to that. Now, this policy has been controversial. It was opposed by the Scottish Conservatives, the Liberal Democrats and Scottish Labour as well, even though the Labour government in Wales is bringing forward a similar scheme. But the Scottish Labour leader Anna Sarwar was keen to highlight the differences between Scotland and Wales.
The First Minister wants to pretend that this scheme is the same one used by the Welsh Government. That is at best disingenuous. The Welsh scheme is either a vaccine or a negative test. Well, will they finally understand that our route out of this pandemic is, yes, partly vaccine, but is fundamentally testing and tracing, both things that this government has woefully failed throughout this pandemic?
First Minister. Anna Sarwar on vaccine passports. I'll come on to NHS pressures in a moment, but on vaccine certification, Anna Sarwar is being deeply disingenuous, opportunistic, and changes his own goalposts at every turn. Because a few weeks ago, Anna Sarwar was not asking us to introduce a scheme that either had proof of vaccine or a negative LFD test. What Anna Sarwar was asking for was only negative tests and not to have proof of vaccine. The reason we don't, at this stage, intend to include a negative test is for all of the reasons that have been set out that while LFD tests are very important, they rely on self-reporting, and at this stage that would, we consider, not be the best approach, but it would also undermine one of the central objectives of the vaccine certification scheme, which is to drive up the uptake rates of vaccine certification.
Now, that update was followed by the news that the industry body representing nightclubs here in Scotland is to launch a legal challenge against the vaccine passport scheme. They say that it is going much further than was initially proposed and could also affect many other venues like hotels and pubs. So the controversy over this continues.
Lizzie, we've heard about the pressures facing the NHS, the Scottish Government asking for support from the Army, and we've got details of what that's going to actually look like.
We do, yes. We got an update from the Health Secretary this week on that. Soldiers are going to be driving ambulances in Scotland from this weekend. We were told that the Ministry of Defence is providing 114 personnel, including drivers and support staff, to carry out non-emergency driving work. We were also told a further 111 personnel will be helping out with COVID mobile testing units. Now, that came as the government was challenged further by opposition parties here about what it's doing to address the pressures facing the health service.
It should never have reached the stage where the fire service, the army and taxi drivers have to bail out frontline care staff. Just this morning, the BMA said that there was no realistic workforce plan that can get the NHS working 10% harder. Presiding officer, this is caused by an interruption in flow throughout our NHS, from GPs to the lack of social care provision, which is leading to delayed discharge. So can I ask the Cabinet Secretary, just how long does he expect this crisis to last?
It's unbelievable that the member stands there and says that it has nothing to do with the pandemic. Of course it has something to do with the pandemic. We are still in the midst of that global pandemic. Case numbers are still too high. Community transmission still too high. So for him, for the member, I should say, to suggest that the pandemic has played no role, I'm afraid, does him no favours. And he can wag his finger all he wishes to do from a sedentary position. But he will lack credibility if he does not acknowledge that fact.
Will the Cabinet Secretary tell me whether John Thompson was wrong when he asked for an increase in bed capacity, and will he urgently consider temporary wards or field hospitals like the Louisa Jordan?
In relation to field hospitals, I mentioned that when it comes to pop-up facilities, there were some concerns and around that. In terms of field hospitals, I've spoken to every single health board, as you'd imagine, and have made mention of the fact that the equipment that we had for the Louisa Jordan is available for them to use. Now, it's not just a case of simply setting up beds. We have to have staffed beds as well. So you'd have to pull the workforce out of extremely busy hospitals and put them in. If she just listens as opposed to shouting from a sedentary position, I'm trying to answer her question with all sincerity, that I'm not dismissing the idea in its entirety, but if you set up beds, that is only part of the resolution. You have to ensure they are staffed beds.
That's it from Holyrood. Lindsay Bewes there. Thank you very much. Now to Wales, where there is a political row about ambulance services too. Cemlyn Davies is in the Welsh Parliament in Cardiff. Cemlyn.
Yes, that's right. For several weeks now, months even, we've been hearing concerns about the increasing pressure on the ambulance service in Wales. That's partly down to the lifting of COVID restrictions, down to the third wave of the pandemic, down to paramedics self-isolating and so on. And this week we've heard cases of ambulances queuing outside hospital for hours on end. Paramedics, in some cases, spending entire shifts outside hospital waiting to offload patients. We've also heard of people having to wait several hours, over 12 hours in one case, for an ambulance to arrive. And one frontline worker has told us that morale within the service is at rock bottom at the moment. Now, the target for the ambulance service is to respond to 65% of the most serious red calls within 8 minutes. Well, according to the latest stats published this week, it actually only managed to reach 57.6% of those red calls within that time in August, and that's the second worst monthly performance since those targets were introduced in 2015. Well, now the Welsh Ambulance Service has made a formal request for military support. In particular, they want drivers to come and help them out. That request was initially made to the Welsh Government, and it's been passed on to the Ministry of Defence now. And this whole situation was debated here in the Senedd on Wednesday as the Welsh Conservatives called on the Welsh Government to recognise that there is an emergency within the ambulance service.
Be in no doubt, the ambulance service is in crisis. It's not just in near crisis, it's in crisis now. Absolutely. And it has been in crisis for some months. Yeah. And we need immediate action from the Welsh Government to support the ambulance service and also ensure that people of Wales get the ambulance service that they deserve and need.
I can assure members that I'm not hiding, I'm not ducking, I am absolutely taking responsibility, and I understand that it is my responsibility to drive change in the system at this time of unprecedented pressure. And I think it is worth underlining the fact that we have never seen anything like this before.
The Health Minister there, and Eluned Morgan, does recognise that there is a problem that needs to be addressed. And what became clear from the debate here on Wednesday is that the issues facing the ambulance service are just a symptom of problems facing the health service as a whole. What we're hearing is that people aren't being released from hospital in a timely manner. That means that hospitals are having to queue, that ambulances are having to queue outside hospital in order to offload patients. And of course, then in some cases, then they're not available to respond to calls. And the Welsh Ambulance Service has apologised to those people who have had to wait longer than they would expect to for an ambulance to arrive.
Cemlyn, we've heard about Scotland's plans for COVID vaccine passports. The Welsh Government is planning something slightly different. Have we heard any more about that this week?
Yes, that's right. So from the 11th of October, people over 18 who want to attend large-scale events or nightclubs will have to prove that either they've had 2 jabs of the COVID vaccine or that they've had a negative lateral flow test in the previous 48 hours. Now, Plaid Cymru and Welsh Conservatives are pressing for a vote to be held on this issue here in the Senedd before that change is introduced. The Welsh Government says it's still working on the timetabling of all that. But in the meantime, the leader of the Conservative group here, Andrew Davies, had a separate question about this issue for the First Minister during this week's FMQs.
You and I have debated across this chamber on the merits and not, as the case may be, about COVID passports. Obviously, that's quite a substantial change from where you as First Minister told me back in July about what your personal position was. Can you explain to me, therefore, that with the COVID pass coming in, what will fall under the category of a nightclub under these restrictions?
The member will be aware that this problem, which I see is repeated as though it was a problem, was already solved. Back earlier in the summer, pubs were open, nightclubs were closed. So there was a legal definition available and operating in Wales because different regulations applied to both sectors. Nightclubs were the last part of the nighttime economy to be able to reopen, and the regulations distinguish between the two.
And members of the Senedd have also been debating the idea of a 4-day week in Wales.
Yes, that's right. And this was an interesting and at times lively debate here in the Senedd brought by Plaid Cymru. They say that people's approach to work has changed as a result of the pandemic and that arrangements need to change now to accommodate those new approaches. Let's hear a bit of that debate.
I'm sure members will agree that we cannot expect to maintain the status quo when it comes to working practices. As I highlighted earlier, automation and, of course, the pandemic have and will change the world of work forever. We cannot bury our heads in the sand. For the good of all workers in Wales, I would hope that this Senedd would agree that there is more to life than work.
If productivity is increased, then it simply means that the employee will have to do 5 days' work in 4 days. Actually, these proposals would, in my mind, be counterproductive for some, because as working hours become more intense, there would be less time for breaks and less time for movement between tasks and locations.
We will continue to take close interest in the evidence around a 4-day working week, in particular evidence that a 4-day working week can improve people's work-life balance, help us cut carbon emissions and air pollution, and support gender equality without resulting in a loss of pay or lowering of terms and conditions, whilst maintaining and hopefully improving productivity.
So a flavour of that debate on a 4-day week. Kemlyn Davis in Cardiff, thank you very much. Let's talk about Prime Minister's questions, Sean, this week, because Boris Johnson wasn't there. He was in the States. So the new Deputy Prime Minister, Dominic Raab, took his place across the dispatch box from Labour's Deputy Leader, Angela Rayner, who filled in for Keir Starmer.
Yeah, now, love it or loathe it, Prime Minister's questions is undoubtedly the highlight of the Westminster week.
Absolutely.
And a bit like theatre, you know, it is a moment of parliamentary theatre. We have understudies, and that's who took the stage this week. And I guess the question that we all had in our minds is, who is going to be playing the role of the sober, serious lawyer, and who is going to be the colourful character with all the sound bites and all of the gags? And it turned out there was a bit of a switcheroo, because Angela Rayner turned out to have come well prepared with some sound bites and some headlines, and Dominic Raab was slightly more subdued, perhaps befitting somebody who's just acquired the new title of Deputy Prime Minister.
Just as energy prices are ballooning, they've chosen to take the money that could cover a year's worth of bills out of the pockets of working people. The Deputy Prime Minister has said the solution is for people to work harder. So can he tell us how many days a worker on the minimum wage would have to work this year in order to afford a night at a luxury hotel, say in Crete?
If she wants to talk about taxes and easing the burden on the lowest paid, I'd remind her, whenever a Labour Party has gone into government, the economy has nosedived, unemployment has soared, and taxes have gone through the roof. Under this government, we cut income tax, saving every worker £1,200 each year.
Mr. Speaker, he talks about the economy. He doesn't even know how much his own holiday costs. So let me tell him, a worker on the minimum wage would need to work an extra 50 days to pay for a single night at his favourite resort. Probably, Mr. Speaker, even more if the sea was open. The very same week that the government is cutting universal credit, working people face soaring energy bills.
I just remind her, though, of her words. It was in The Guardian in the 11th of May, so it must be true. She said, the Labour Party must stop talking down to people. Working class people don't want a handout, they want opportunities. They're getting those opportunities. Mr. Speaker, they're getting those opportunities under a Conservative government, with catch-up tutoring for over 2 million children this academic year, hundreds of thousands of jobs for young people under our Kickstart scheme.
Because of this government's choices, people are having to choose between heating their homes or feeding their families. For all their empty rhetoric, you can't level up by making people poorer. So can the Deputy Prime Minister explain why he's stubbornly refusing to consider introducing an emergency energy payment that would help families through a very difficult winter?
The price cap in place will save 50 million households up to £100 each year. On top of that, because of the approach we've taken with the national living wage, full-time workers will be £4,000 per year better off. But can I just also say to her, I think given the challenges that we understandably face, people expect, including in Scotland, for us to come together, stop this scaremongering, stop this sowing of division.
So that was Prime Minister's questions with the Deputy, Sean. But there was also a debate more generally about squeezed household incomes.
Yeah, we saw there the exchanges were really focusing on the cost of living. And there's been a lot of pressure from opposition MPs over the decision to end the temporary £20 an increase in universal credit that was brought in at the start of the pandemic. Now, it's not the only issue that's been raised when people have been talking about the cost of living. This week, MPs were asked to approve the legislation that helps the government break an election promise, if you like. This is the whole business of the triple lock on pensions. The government didn't want to see pensions rise by 8%, so they've introduced legislation to keep it down this year. But what we saw during that debate was a number of MPs, not just opposition MPs, people like Ian Duncan Smith, the former Tory leader, the person who introduced universal credit, and others also pushing back on this decision to end what is known as the uplift.
Provisional ONS figures shows an increase in earnings of 8.3%, which is over 2 percentage points higher than at any time over the last 2 decades. Given this statistical spike in earnings is down to a COVID-related distortion, I'm seeking the agreement of Parliament to again set aside the earnings link for just one more year, 2022-23. And I have put this on the face of the bill to award the higher of inflation, or 2.5%, applying in effect again a double lock policy. The triple lock policy will be applied in the usual way from next year for the remainder of the Parliament. This government is committed to ensuring that older people can enjoy their retirement with security, dignity and respect. And since 2010, the full yearly basic stamp pension has increased by over £2,050 in cash terms.
We're being asked to vote for a change in the law to suspend the earnings-related part of the triple lock for 1 year, while retaining the link to prices and the commitment to raise the state pension by a minimum of 2.5%. This, Mr. Speaker, is a very important issue and one which directly affects millions of people today, and also the value of state pensions for future generations. Mr. Deputy Speaker, Labour supports the triple lock. Indeed, all major parties committed to maintain the triple lock in the 2019 general election.
When I resigned from the job that my right honourable friend now holds, I did so on 2 or 3 particular bases, but the number one basis that I did was that the then Treasury took a significant sum of money, something in the order of much the same as the uplift, out of universal credit. I always made this point very early on, that with universal credit, when you put the money into it, you are investing in a dynamic process. It is a process that by its very nature reduces the overall cost, because the more you get into work, the lower the overall cost of the money that you actually put in.
As we all know, this is a bill which facilitates this Tory government breaking yet another manifesto commitment, namely breaking the pensions triple lock, which all parties in this chamber committed to at the election less than 2 years ago. Now, breaking that manifesto pledge follows on from scrapping the commitment to spend 0.7% of GNI on the world's poorest with our international aid budget, and it now comes on top of the new Tory poll tax, which sees hard-working Scots endure a hike in national insurance to pay for sorting out the utter mess of England's health and social care system.
We all accept that we've lived in exceptional times over the past 18 months and the earnings growth this year is out of the ordinary. But the big picture here is that this government is refusing to take any action to lift any group out of poverty. And by refusing to do this, it highlights the hollowness of the phrase levelling up. They're cutting universal credit, taking away vital income from 5.5 million households and pushing thousands of families further into poverty.
Well, that was the debate, Sean. What's happening with the bill?
Well, the bill went through all of its common stages in one day. So those attempts to try to introduce changes in universal credit have failed. There isn't a parliamentary route really available to Ian Duncan-Smith and those Tory rebels now.
Thank you very much, Sean. Now, to Northern Ireland and to hear about the past week at Stormont. Let's catch up with our Ireland correspondent, Chris Page. Chris, there's been progress on a significant piece of legislation on organ donation.
Yeah, that's right, Joe. This is quite a prominent example of how some parts of the law here in Northern Ireland are different to the rest of the UK. It's the situation here that the law presumes when you die, you don't want to donate your organs unless you specifically sign up to do so. So this piece of legislation would switch things round. So in essence, the presumption, the legal presumption would be that people are willing to donate their organs to a transplant patient unless they expressly say they do not want that to happen. So charities and the families of transplant patients have been campaigning for this for a long time. There is generally strong political support behind the bill. A few objections were raised when the legislation reached the floor of the Stormont Assembly for the first time by some members of the Democratic Unionist Party, and basically their concerns were based around the whole issue of individual liberties. The bill was proposed by the Health Minister, a member of the Ulster Unionist Party, Robin Swan.
This bill will mean that adults in Northern Ireland will be considered potential donors unless they choose to opt out or are excluded. Around 115 people in Northern Ireland are on the transplant waiting list, and every year around 10 to 15 people in Northern Ireland die waiting on an organ transplant. This bill will help to reduce the number of people waiting for life-saving transplants.
It's not an easy position for people to come to for deemed consent. It's a big step for any country. Not a decision to be taken lightly. Not one necessarily to be ultimately and finally and without giving consideration to our thoughtfulness on the issue.
So a handful of objections raised along the lines of that argument expressed there by the DUP's Joanne Bunting, but the bill did pass its second reading. It now goes on to the committee stage, where it will be examined in more detail.
And Chris, there's been a debate about appointments to public bodies.
Yes, I suppose this bill really went to the heart of some of the tensions around the power-sharing system in the devolved government at Stormont. It was brought forward by Jim Allister, the leader of the traditional Unionist Voice Party. He's that party's only member of the Stormont Assembly, but he is, many would say, a particularly effective MLA. And he founded the TUV back in 2007, essentially in protest at the DUP's decision to go into power sharing with Sinn Féin. Mr Allister was himself a member of the DUP for many years. So a few years ago he was successful in passing some legislation which meant that anyone with a serious criminal conviction couldn't serve as a special advisor in the devolved government. So the principal focus of his intentions was members of Sinn Féin. He used to be in the IRA. This time around, he's chosen to focus on appointments to public bodies. And there's been two examples of this which have been a source of debate here recently. Firstly, earlier this year, Paul Kavanagh, a former Sinn Féin special advisor who's convicted of the IRA bombing of Chelsea Barracks in London in 1981, was appointed to the Education Authority, which oversees schools. Also, Jerry Kelly, a member of the Stormont Assembly, convicted in the 1970s of the Old Bailey bombing in London. He sits on the board which oversees the work of the Police Service of Northern Ireland. So Mr Allister's legislation, if passed, would have removed both of those men from those public positions. Sinn Féin, the Nationalist Party, the SDLP and the Alliance Party all opposed Mr Allister's bill, and this is the argument that Mr Allister set out whenever he was called to make the case.
What is the message of this House today to upcoming generations? That it's okay to kill, it's okay to murder, provided you do it in the name of some supposed cause? Then you can become political elite, appointed to public office, paid from public office.
Opposition to political progress is Mr Allister's political raison d'etre. This is a wrecker's bill designed to turn the clock back and to exclude. It limits the participation of one section of our society who elect and put into office Jerry Kelly and other members of my party in election after election. Fundamentally, this is an anti-democratic piece of legislation.
So Unionists supported Mr Allister's bill, but it was defeated at this stage and it goes no further.
Chris, there have also been discussions about how to handle COVID going forward. Tell us about those.
Yes, this week ministers in the Stormont Executive have held their first face-to-face meeting in about a year, but there's really no sign of a substantial change in the COVID regulations, which are broadly more strict here than in the rest of the UK. For example, there are still restrictions on the number of people you can have inside your home. It's a maximum of 15 from 4 households. Nightclubs aren't open. The likes of concert promoters are saying they really need to be allowed to run big events indoors again. However, the legal advice from the Department of Health is that none of the remaining legal restrictions should be changed at the moment, that infection rates are still high. So that means the likes of 1 metre social distancing inside hospitality venues will remain in place. This week, the Deputy First Minister, Michelle O'Neill of Sinn Féin, returned to her desk after 3 weeks off due to COVID. She said it had been a frightening experience. At one stage, she thought she was going to have to go to hospital, but she was glad she was double jabbed. And that remains a concern of the devolved government here. Northern Ireland's vaccination rate has fallen behind the rest of the UK.
Thank you, Chris. Chris Page at Stormont. Now it's party conference season, and over the next few weeks and months, we will be covering all the major political party conferences. This week, it was the turn of the Liberal Democrats. What were Lib Dem leader Sir Ed Davy's big ideas?
Well, this was a huge moment for Sir Ed Davy, because this was the first time he'd been able to give a speech live since he became leader last year, because obviously COVID meant he was stuck in a kind of virtual world when he wanted to speak. So he gave his big keynote conference speech to about 150 activists. It all gathered in Canary Wharf in London. He had quite a good story to tell, actually, because, of course, during the summer, the Lib Dems won, as they would say, a famous by-election victory when they won Chesham and Amersham. And he, if you remember, those famous photographs when he had his little yellow hammer knocking down the blue wall. So that did feature as well as policy. There were some pretty fierce attacks on Boris Johnson, but he was keen to set out his stall, and his big idea was to focus on education. And he wants to see a £15 billion programme to support education over the next 3 years. And the key thing is £5 billion of that would go to parents to help them with education costs.
Boris Johnson's Conservative government is steering us all into another terrible crisis. Shoppers greeted by empty shelves in the supermarket. House building materials stopped for a lack of materials. Pubs running dry. Fears that there won't even be enough toys or turkeys for Christmas. It's enough to make you go and lie down. But we're even facing a shortage of mattresses. Parents should get catch-up vouchers to spend on what they want for their child's education. Parents could choose to spend it with their child's own school, on an after-school homework club, on one-to-one tuition, on special extracurricular activities, from sports to music lessons, provided for that child by their school. Or parents could choose to spend it on tuition they organise, or with a music teacher they find, or on therapy and counselling and so on. As long as it was supporting the education and well-being of their child, it would be the parents' choice. The UK should be leading the world on climate action with a radical new approach to move trillions of dollars, yen, euros and pounds out of fossil fuels and into renewables by properly holding to account the powerful fossil fuel firms and the powerful in the City of London. Banning new oil, gas and coal companies from the London Stock Exchange, stopping the flow of money from your pension funds into the dirty industries of the past. Liberal Democrats can be the party of education, of caring and of business. I know we can do it. Our Liberal Democrat threat has already forced government U-turns on everything from planning to ID cards. So let's keep fighting for parents, for carers and for small businesses.
So Ed Davey setting out his stall there. Now, we have obviously the Labour Party conference coming up. Sir Keir Starmer, the Labour leader, will want to do a similar thing in terms of telling his party faithful what he believes in and his vision. Now, he's had a little bit of an internal wrangle over attempts to change the rules on how future Labour leaders will be elected, and he's written this long essay, 14,000 words, to try and convince people, or at least tell people, what he's about.
That's right. This is an opportunity, obviously, for Keir Starmer to introduce himself to the wider British public, not just talk to his party. We saw Ed Davey doing that to a certain extent there at the Lib Dem conference, that they want to talk over the heads of the party faithful. But you're right, Keir Starmer's got himself embroiled in a row over the Labour Party's internal rules. That might leave some people outside the Labour Party a little bit cool. This essay is designed to set out who he is, what he believes in, and give a little sense of what his vision of the country will be. It's his opportunity, I guess, to launch himself after the pandemic and prepare for the next election, whenever that might be.
Thank you very much, Sean Curran here in Westminster. That's all we've got time for today. I will be back on BBC Two on Monday with Politics Live and, of course, next Friday with more Politics UK. From all of us here, bye-bye.